fear I am tiring of ARC discourse online and am ready to make it everybody else's problem as well. Or more accurately and less clickbaity, I just want to have a casual discussion about the ARC discourse I've been seeing recently, primarily on Threads. And this may just be a Threads issue, as I am still trying to figure out if this is a platform that I am interested in engaging with on a deeper level, because I'm seeing a lot of the same kind of trends that made me take a step back from Bookstagram, namely like begging for followers and an emphasis on followers over engaging with content organically that is exacerbated by the algorithm for sure, then kind of compounded with a lot of kind of clickbait kind of ideas, which some of this discourse that I am tiring of, I absolutely believe is part of this clickbait cycle. But just kind of how we are seeing arcs and the trend of discourse and discussion around arcs kind of being part of that cyclical discourse in bookish spaces online that we talk about pretty ad nauseum, as new people are always entering the community and different platforms and social media talks about it much differently, but also how we have seen a rise in kind of this challenging of things that I, as a reader who first kind of came in to bookish spaces online through blogs in like 2012, 2013 era, we're seeing this challenging, or I'm seeing this challenging of things I took for granted in relation especially to arcs, many of which I think should be taken for granted, kind of challenged, especially in this landscape of self-publishing being so prominent. Not to say it wasn't prominent and prevalent in 2013, just that it was a much different landscape. And the way these conversations are being had, the rise of bookish influencers, the rise of the idea of paid reviews, which I don't agree with, at the same time also believing that influencers should be paid for their work, but just the kind of dynamic between a paid review and a promotion, or a review, I should say, and a promotion. And also, just a full disclosure, while I have been in online bookish spaces for over a decade and on Goodreads since 2007, and I am here on YouTube and technically monetized on YouTube, I am not an influencer in the sense that I often don't even take home or reach the threshold for payout on YouTube every month, but I have never been someone that publishers send their books to outright, or that publishers seek out. Now, some of that is too that I have not personally sought out relationships with publishers. However, that does not mean I have not read arcs. And it goes back to, turn the clock around, the 2013 blog days. And this is why I am very empathetic to a lot of the conversations that now maybe I don't view the same way, but I recognize the mindset of early 20s Melody, who may have had similar ideas about arcs and the kind of thirst to have access to arcs. Because I signed up for NetGalley in 2013-ish in order to get books to review on my blog that was never really a thing, but was a great outlet for me, as I have always tried to have an outlet in order to talk about books. Now, I no longer have a NetGalley account, and I feel like NetGalley is talked about a lot on Threads. I was part of the data breach years ago at this point, and I kind of took that as the gift that it was in terms of a clean slate and kind of stepping away from that and the rat race, so to speak, of the NetGalley approval to review kind of percentage. And I feel like also my perspective on how I view arcs and my relationship with arcs has changed pretty dramatically in the last couple of years when kind of reflecting on my entry into bookish spaces. And part of this is age, part of this is absolutely just having more ability and means to buy books. That is not to say that books are cheap as they get ever more expensive, but it's all kind of part and parcel of the same thing. That is to say, I recognize the thirst and the hunger and the excitement of receiving an arc, especially when I was in my early 20s. I didn't have a whole lot of money, though post-college I was always very lucky. I have been in two of the largest, I believe, national library systems since I graduated college. I've been in the Chicago Public Library system and the Cleveland Public Library system, both systems that I cannot say anything but good things about, in addition, of course, to having grown up in my hometown library system, which was also excellent, but had a much stricter budget than somewhere like Chicago and Cleveland, where I can look up a book that I'm interested in, and I think I've maybe requested a book one time. Like, it's usually always in the system. But going back to the before and that kind of NetGalley mindset, having access to books, and in some ways, it made me, a much younger me, feel like I was part of a community and a conversation that at the time, while still invigorated online, was much more compartmentalized in the sense of having these separate blogs. And as much as I am a part of communities online to this day, including here, where I feel like I've connected with a number of you and really and genuinely enjoy that connection, whether it be in the comments, during live streams, if I ever get back to doing that, now that the weather is nicer. But at the same time, I always feel like a lurker on the internet in some ways, in that it's hard not to compare your community with the community of others, or your growth trajectory with the growth trajectory of others. And even in your 30s, that can be hard. Now, luckily, I have a much better sense of how to kind of take a step back, assess my feelings, and recognize that I'm going to keep doing things and talking about things in a way that feels organic and true to me, whatever that may mean. But in my earlier days, there was a sense of, oh, I belong to something because I've been gifted this free copy. And I do think that that feeds into something today. I had kind of an outline of ideas, which I'm trying to be better about, but I feel like we're going to move into tangent territory very easily, or might jump around in some of the things that I want to talk about. So I'm going to put a pin in that, in the sense of this idea of community and potential parasocial relationships I am seeing or thinking about in relation to contemporary art culture. So at this time, I was getting a lot of the read now books. I did not have a very established digital presence. I had a Goodreads, I had a blog. I didn't have a huge readership, right? I wasn't part of the blog boom. And so I wasn't getting the really highly coveted arcs, but I was getting approved for arcs on NetGalley, and I was trying to actively beef up that ratio. And I was requesting things I'm generally or was generally interested in. And so it was a way to discover new writers. And I did discover a lot of things that I really love and continue to really love and talk about to this day. For instance, I believe Kelly Link's Get in Trouble, I believe I reviewed that on NetGalley. How I got approved for that book, I'm really not sure. And it speaks to kind of how we talk about that today, because at its heart, ARCs, or advanced reader copies, which I'm realizing in this moment I should have introduced the concept of at the beginning as kind of the laying of the land. Many of you, if you're watching this, probably know, but bear with me. So an advanced reader copy is an early copy of a book that is sent out to reviewers in order to generate buzz for a title. These are free copies, and they are sent out before the book has been through its final copy edit, and oftentimes there are still editorial edits that can happen, which is why you will often see the disclaimer that you should not quote directly from the ARC before checking with the finished copy, which I will admit I wasn't always great at in my early days, and to this day I think a lot of people are going to be quoting from that ARC. It's just a disclaimer. Now, a disclaimer that is a little bit more prevalent, though when I was looking for it on my ARCs during the ARC reselling debacle and controversies, I was having trouble pinpointing it or finding it on the ARCs that I still have in my possession, but this idea that ARCs are not for sale. Now, the semantics of this not for sale have been somewhat under debate, at least to my Threads feed recently, in the sense that once it has been gifted to a reader, do they have the right to resale versus that initial no value? Now, the important part initially is that that ARC does not carry monetary value, because reviewers cannot be seen as being paid for their reviews, because then it could be seen as a bribe or a way to kind of skew the review. And I think it's also going to be clear throughout this discussion that I've only read ARCs from traditional publishers. I have been offered ARCs from self-published authors, and I have been intrigued by some of them, but there is such a weight to that. For me, I never want to be disingenuous with a review, and I don't consider myself a mean reviewer by any means, but there is one less barrier between you, the reader, and the author in that scenario. And even if the author is behaving completely above board, which the majority do, it is still this sense that there's more of that personal connection, and I am more aware of what a negative review could do. I don't know. There's a lot of complication there. I'm not saying I won't pick up a book on my own and review it honestly, but part of that initial ARC push, I don't know. But I think that is part of the conversation that we will be having later as well. And so I started as a digital ARC reader. I've had a Kindle since college, the early Kindle with the buttons on the side and the keyboard at the bottom. Actually, let me show you. I've still got this guy. I don't use it much anymore because it does have some cracks on the screen, pressure cracks, that I actually had my first version of this replaced for. And this is also the model they had to take off the market because it had the text to voice feature for books. So books would just read it in like essentially an AI voice, and that does not gel with copyright for audiobooks. Anyway, I read primarily digital ARCs. Now, coming out of college, Instagram was a much different thing in college. It felt a little bit more kind of just snapshotty. Honestly, a lot of the vibes that Gen Z feels like they're trying to return to in relation to Instagram feels like its early instincts. But we obviously know that Instagram moved into this much more curated and visually appealing thing, which I absolutely love, and I love the visuals and aesthetics of Bookstagram. But with that, physical ARCs became much more coveted because it was a tangible thing. And for some books, there is absolutely to this day a kind of status symbol associated with receiving a certain ARC, whether we want to think about it that way or not. I think it is most evident in particularly like Sally Rooney releases. I'm thinking not even of Intermezzo here, but like Beautiful World, Where Are You? When they sent out like the bucket hats and things. I think that they tried to kind of curb that or fix that a little bit with the Intermezzo releases and pairing with specific independent booksellers to have Intermezzo kind of swag. I do have some questions about how different bookstores got paired up with that in terms of what bookstores in Chicago were part of that, but I was out of the country for that. So that's a discussion for maybe another day. But at the time, like 2013 through 2019 even, physical ARCs were a much more prevalent thing. And I don't really think I need to tell any of you that. However, I absolutely, kind of bought in to the idea of the physical ARC. And this was even before I was really on Bookstagram. And honestly, it could be argued, am I even really on Bookstagram now based on my follower account? But I'm not going to be engaging in those kinds of discussions. But I began working at a bookstore in 2015, 2016-ish when I moved back to Chicago. And with that, I had a lot more access to physical ARCs because they were sent to bookstores, because this makes sense. We go back to the main driver or reason for ARCs existing is to sell books. So of course they're going to be sent to people who are responsible for directly putting books in customers' hands, and to those people online who sell books, who are able to turn their book recommendations into book sales, or who have a large audience that can be reached with a particular book, or have a highly curated specific audience, and that book is such a fit for that highly curated specific audience that it makes sense to pair those together because you're getting that book in front of its ideal readership. Now, I'm spitballing all of this here based on my knowledge of existing in this space for over a decade and just kind of common sense. I have not worked in publishing. I've been an intern for a literary agent, but that is a different can of worms. So I started getting a lot more physical ARCs working at the bookstore, and this was both exciting and also took a little bit of the shine off, in the sense that it didn't become this like highly covetous thing. I understood the kind of reasoning behind it. I would see ARCs sometimes left in the break room if no one was interested, versus ARCs that people may pass around a little bit more. But with them being more readily available, it wasn't as much as a status symbol per se. Now, I fully admit to sometimes bragging to my friends if I have an ARC I am very excited about, or is something we as a collective are kind of interested in, particularly in book club. But I'm not proud of that fact, and more it's just kind of like sharing the title, and that's again part of the word of mouth that are the reasons for the ARCs, because it's not like, look what I have, not a boo-boo. It's, oh, I'm reading this thing that I know we're all really gonna enjoy. And around this time too, which also coincided with kind of the beginning and height of Booktube, though I was not engaged on the platform at the time, I went to my first Book Expo America, and one of the only ones they had outside of New York, in Chicago toward the end of Book Expo's tenure, because it has not come back post 2020, and I really don't foresee it coming back because it really was focused on physical books. So I went as a bookseller because at the time I was a bookseller. That being said, my bookstore did not pay my way. I paid my way. I took PTO from work to go to this and to learn more about new titles. And even though I was basically there alone, I did see, you know, some of the behavior around specific books. And even though, and maybe especially because I was there alone, I was able to see kind of some of the behaviors and different types of people that were there, because you had the booksellers, you had the librarians, you could even go as like a book club or a book club leader, and then you also had like book influencers, because I want to say this was before, maybe just slightly before, they spun BookCon off of Book Expo America, and so they kind of separated the industry professionals versus like the influencers and the fans of books, because especially at this time it was the height of YA fiction, and it was very difficult to get some arcs and very competitive. Even like this was right before Lanny Taylor's Strange the Dreamer came out. They weren't even giving out full arcs of Strange the Dreamer, just like little goodie bags and like a chapter sample. Even that had like a line or demand for it. And I remember I, like by the skin of my teeth, got a Caraval, however we're actually pronouncing it. I should know because it is a Book Talk darling. I got an arc of that by happenstance and maybe some connections in the booth. But especially for young adult fiction, there was a lot of demand, especially from what at least was perceived as the influencer crowd, which I didn't always appreciate because, one, I think it was very reductive. And that's not to say that I felt judgment on the trade floor all the time, but I did have at least one notable experience where, was I in the Penguin booth? I think it was the Penguin booth. I was basically looking at the newest at the time release from Emer McBride, who wrote A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, which I have read, and the person working the booth looked at me and said, "Oh, that's not a young adult novel." And I said, "I know, because I had a mix of all kinds of novels. I had adult, I had young adult, I had The Girl Who Drank the Moon," which remains one of my favorite middle grade books to this day. So it was just this very interesting time. But all that to say, there was a level of hype around the receiving or the getting of arcs that day. And I feel like that energy still exists online, and I understand it to a certain extent, right? Because I went to Book Expo America. I was absolutely excited to go home with bags and bags full of free books, though of course I did pay the entry fee, and I didn't always time it right, because at least one day I took the Red Line home at rush hour with like tote bags full of books, which was not ideal. All that to say, I've been there, I get it. But as I've gotten older, and again, there is a lot of privilege in this because I have more financial means to buy books. At the same time, in the last year, I really have kind of pulled back even on my book buying. I still and have always utilized my library very heavily throughout as well, but I have kind of pulled back from arcs as much for me, in the sense that, and a lot of it is just personal preference and just how my reading life, or what is driving my reading life right now, but it removes some of the pressure to have read something by a certain date, especially as a mood reader. Though with arcs, you despite what some of the discourse will want you to think. And again, I feel like indie publishing is its own kind of beast that has been making some of its own rules. Not all of them I agree with. If you request an ARC, you have asked for it. It is good form to review that thing, right? But if you have been sent an unsolicited ARC, you did not ask for it, you were doing the publisher a favor by posting that review. That review should never be taken for granted if you have never even expressed interest in the book. They are sending it to you in the hopes that you will feature it, the hopes that you will read it and love it. But there is no obligation therein, especially because, again, publishers aren't paying influencers for this work. And a review is a lot more work. You have the time reading the book. You have to be actively engaged in the book or with the book in a way that is different. Your brain may read differently for review versus for pleasure. It may not, and it's fine either way, but there is a different layer of analysis potentially at play there. And I do understand the critique that people in trade publications get paid to review, and so there is this idea that influencers should be paid for their reviews. Similarly, if they are being asked to do this thing, I think that it is important to recognize with that. One, again, I'm not arguing that influencers should be taken advantage of. Book influencers, people who actively engage with work, who think about it, who promote it, who sell books, that they should be taken for granted. However, I also think, again, there is that dicey area, but if you're looking at something like Kirkus or Publishers Weekly or the reviews coming out of Booklist with the American Library Association, those individuals that review those books are getting paid through the entity, not from the publisher. And that is an important distinction in terms of how their opinions may or not be influenced. Now, in terms of my blogger days, because it was later than like the height of blogs, I often forget I did write for the Booklist reader for a time. I feel like all of those blogs have been lost to the ether post 2020 when they redid their website, and I kind of lost contact with the people I was engaged with over there. But I wrote blogs, and full disclosure, I was paid a little bit of money for those blogs, but I kind of had free reign. Like, I would pitch an idea, and so they were never asking me to write about specific books. I was organically writing about specific books and then being like, hey, are you interested in this idea? And now a lot of those ideas are here for you all on YouTube because I needed an outlet. But okay, I pulled back for the sense of not feeling as pressured, not having all of those books kind of piling up in similar ways to how I talked earlier this year about how I slowed a lot of my book buying because I was feeling kind of claustrophobic in my TBR, and I know that my TBR will never be finished. I keep adding books. Obviously, we have very extensive anticipated release videos every month, or every month I'm in the country. Every month, I try every month. Anyway, I'm not pretending like I'm not adding books all the time, but again, especially in a small space, feeling that pile up, and even on my e-reader, feeling it pile up, especially as after I no longer worked at the bookstore, I primarily went back to reviewing digitally and reading ARCs digitally that I was still actively requesting. And I really have pulled back on a lot of that recently, for good or for ill, in a lot of ways, because it is unquestionably nice to have your finger on the pulse, to talk about things that are new and exciting. But I realized that I was going to read the books regardless. I could get them through traditional means, and especially with digital ARCs, the formatting is often so bad that it didn't really feel worth it. Now, I will say, since transferring to a Kobo, which does have a learning curve from a Kindle, the formatting issue is often better because they kind of format the page for the EPUB versus like Kindle. You can increase the text size a lot more actively within the ARC, which is nice, but the formatting isn't really consistent in a way that it often is if you sideload it onto the Kobo. But then it's hard to read sometimes based on the screen size, and I just recognized that I could just wait for it to come out, and oftentimes too being interested in that final version. For instance, earlier this year I was rereading Wicked and the Wallflower for my Wallflower romance recommendation video post Bridgerton season 3, and I was reading it between a library copy I had checked out, and I realized I still had a digital ARC on an old Kindle. And so I was reading between the two. And as I was reading between the two one night before bed, just in the natural kind of switch off from physical book to ebook, because I decided I didn't want to hold a book in bed that night, I realized that there were things in the physical book, there were like a couple of paragraphs of that section in the physical book that were not in the ebook. And from that point on, in that reading, I only read the physical book. So that was kind of a moment for me too, where I was like, I want to read the best, most polished version of the thing. Like if I'm organically interested in the thing, I'm interested in talking about it anyway. I will get my hands on it. I will talk about it. And it just makes sense for me in my reading life right now to react and to spend my time with the most polished version of the thing, especially in an environment where the polishing is becoming more valuable by the day. Now, am I saying this is how everyone should interact with ARCs? Absolutely not, because they are still meant to drive conversation and interest around a title and to connect a book with that book's audience and their readers. It's not about necessarily selling a book to everyone, but about matching that book with who that book will resonate with. And so there is still so much value in how ARCs and advanced copies are engaged with in bookish spaces. However, I think the rise of social media in particular and the rise of the bookish influencer that has really been exacerbated, I would argue, since TikTok. Now, I recognize that Booktube had a similar ecosystem many moons ago. Again, I was never really a part of that, but I do not argue with the fact that you had similar critiques, I'm sure, of this idea and this perception of people being given something for free that you as a reader have to pay for. And I think that this is a conception that is kind of translating across niches online, whether it is always applicable to the book community or not. Now, we have seen obviously massive growth in the book community in the last half a decade, which is fabulous, but it means that a lot of the kind of norms we took for granted before are being questioned and challenged. And one of the most direct ways that they're being questioned and challenged, and again, questioning and challenging is not always a bad thing, because there are systems in place that should be challenged, absolutely. But with the rise, particularly of independent and self-publishing, which have nuances that I'm not prepared to go into here, and I recognize that I am not as deeply read in self-published or independent work as I could or should be. However, with this, you have an added extra layer other than just, seeing people bemoaning not being approved for a Berkeley title. And what do they have to do to be approved for this particular publisher's title? To the point where some people are engaging in, dare I say, almost pick-me-ish behavior and verbiage around how they would never give a bad review if they had been gifted a free copy. No. You are allowed to respond to a book however you respond to it. You are allowed to critique it. You are allowed to not like it, even if you have gotten it for free. That is the whole point of it being free. This idea that you are not incentivizing positive reviews and that people can respond to something however they respond to something. We're not always going to agree on a work. And sure, I have seen negative reviews of books I love. I have seen misunderstandings of characters or plot lines that one glass of wine in a review read make me want to fight the reviewer. I don't, because I am an adult. But all that to say is it's this kind of exacerbation, a little bit, again, I think, of that status symbol, especially depending on the publisher and how in demand that publisher or that author's books may be, and whether you received a copy or not. And that is a kind of rat race I'm just really not interested in engaging with anymore. Am I grateful and excited to get ARCs for books I'm excited about? Absolutely, but I am no longer attaching my self-worth to whether or not I've gotten an arc that is anticipated or that I have been looking forward to. And I think it's a combination of not putting all of your self-worth in your social media presence as well, which is hard. But I think a lot of this is translating over from people and readers and reviewers cutting their teeth on self-published and indie books, which again, I wholeheartedly believe people absolutely are attempting to support the authors for, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to support the author. Where the problem comes in is hearing these kind of horror stories of these rules that some indie authors have established in relation to what it means to read an arc for them or to be given an arc from them in terms of when you can post your review based on how you're reviewing it. And a lot of these rules that are attempting to kind of almost game the system. And I recognize and appreciate that the algorithm is ruthless and it is so hard to stand out from the crowd and to kind of get your name out there as an author. I absolutely respect, appreciate, and am sympathetic to that. But if I hear as a reader that you have a rule that people can't post anything less than 4 stars or even 4 stars or less, 3 stars or less until after a certain date, or that you may track that review down and ask it to be taken down, or just that rule existing, I am going to be significantly less likely to read your book, to the point where I already have enough books I am anxiously anticipating reading. I have no desire to enter that, because as a reader, as someone who reviews to whatever depth I may, whether it's just a star rating to market for myself in terms of my own internal enjoyment or a more thought out review, that no longer feels like a safe space for me as a reader or as a reviewer, because I know that you are actively engaging with those reviews. And I see a level of this. And I recognize, again, I am sympathetic to the pressures of being an independent and or a self-published author. And yet I continue to see this kind of policing of review behavior or using ARC readers as a promo team or a publicity team. And I think you need to separate the two. And I do believe a lot of authors do, to be absolutely clear. You have ARC readers and then you have your street team, to my knowledge, because I've never been on either. And I know that there are pros and cons to all of it. And I think all of it is exacerbated, again, returning to this idea of kind of parasocial relationships and how you as a reader and an author interact with each other within these spaces and what readers become accustomed to in these spaces, especially in terms of access to authors. And I think it goes both ways, absolutely. Some readers become way too familiar with the authors they are supporting, and too many authors feel too comfortable entering reviewer spaces. Again, understanding the instinct of why, but I see a lot of threads kind of asking for absolution almost in how they, as an author who knows that they shouldn't be interacting with reviews, are absolved of whatever interaction with reviews because it was an interaction tinged this way. They weren't talking down to the reader or correcting the reader, they were thanking them. So that's different, right? And I understand the instinct, and again, it's not coming from a bad place. And I think we've talked about a lot of this in my video about reviews being for readers a year or two ago now at this point. But I once had an author react or interact with a negative review of his book that I wrote. And it wasn't a super in-depth review because it was just kind of a Goodreads review for myself. It wasn't super extensive. The book just ultimately wasn't to my taste, and I acknowledged that and recognized that in the review. And he either just flat out liked the review on Goodreads or even said thank you in the comments. So again, not ill-intentioned at all, but it removed this barrier in relation to me reacting to something organically and having the space to react to that organically, especially because I think I may still use Goodreads differently than a lot of people because I joined it in 2007. So there are some times that I write out super elaborate, well-thought reviews, and there are times that I just rate it, or times that I just rate it and write like little notes to myself, because for me, they are inherently still for myself, and sometimes I do forget that they go to the wider public. Also, my reviews aren't really going to the wider public in the sense that they're not, going to be the top of any particular book's reviews, but I was coming from a system prior to that where I had like reading logs for school, and I was so excited to transfer over to this digital reading log. And so I have approached a lot of it with that mindset still. And that is okay. We get into a lot of discourse about 3-star reviews for books you like, a lot of ad nauseum cyclical discourse. Like all of this I'm indulging in it. I recognize that, but it's because Goodreads in particular has kind of morphed beyond a place where people organically kind of interact with books to a juggernaut of marketing. And so there is this understanding to a certain extent that advanced readers and reviewers are marketing the book, but they are not beholden to give a good review. This is a conversation I feel like we've had a little bit more in depth, at least semi-recently, but just kind of the atmosphere around ARCs. And again, a lot of this made me kind of take a step back from Bookstagram in some ways too, but I worry about the blurring of the lines in relation to how some of these new readers are learning how to interact with ARCs or about ARCs in relation to some of these rules, which I think we have kind of agreed on universally when presented to the larger community, that those are not rules that should exist, but they have become the norm in some circles, and I don't want them to be seen as the norm in the larger reading community. And again, because we have had this influx of new readers, which is exciting and invigorating, but then there's the opportunity to take advantage of these new readers in the sense of, again, this hunger to have books to talk about and to review, and then what you are trying to demand of these readers who are earnestly trying to engage with the work. Honestly, there is, again, that enthusiasm there, which I am never discrediting. Now, at the same time, me as a reader, I know that parasocial relationship aside, I personally need a little bit of that distance between me as a reader reviewer and the author, to the point where sometimes when I go even to book events, which I love, and I love talking to authors, I like worry about how I've engaged with their book in the past, or like, can I engage with this author if I've not given everything I've read from them 5 stars, which I recognize is anxiety brain and ridiculous, do not worry. But I think that part of that is speaking to like a parasocial leaning or tendency that can be exacerbated when some of those safeguards or safety rails come down. And again, I'm also not saying, even in the current moment, when I largely have stepped back from requesting ARCs in this moment, I'm not saying I will never request ARCs again, I will never read ARCs again. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just, taking the space to kind of reevaluate how I engage with ARCs, and so that it is about talking about the work instead of getting kind of sucked into this cycle or this ecosystem in which it is about having the ARC. And I'm not saying I am above that ecosystem. I am not saying I have not been bummed out even in the past year if I see an arc for a book that I'm really anticipating and I know that there is absolutely no chance that I am going to be offered that arc. For instance, I was absolutely jealous when I saw people showing the arc for Mariana Enriquez's new short story collection, A Sunny Place for Shady People, especially people who had indicated that they had never read Enriquez before, when I have sat here and talked about her a decent amount. I mean, it's not all I talk about, but a decent amount. But that being said, one, I recognize getting her work into new hands is vastly important. At the same time, I recognize these are people who have huge, massive audiences, and I want this book to succeed. And I already know that I am going to buy it. Even if I had been gifted an arc, I was still going to want a finished copy. And so that takes a little of the sting out of it. It's looking at the practicalities, or I'm looking at the practicalities rather than letting my feelings get hurt, which is an absolutely valid feeling. I understand. I understand the jealousy, I understand the hurt, I understand the yearning to whatever extent, because again, I'm not saying that I have not had that same mindset at a different point in my life. But at the same time, I would also be lying if I said in this current moment, I'm not getting kind of annoyed at the discourse regarding why certain people got arcs and I didn't, or bemoaning not getting an arc. I understand the desire for the arc and being disappointed and venting that disappointment. But for whatever reason recently, it feels like my threads feed has been either people upset that they didn't get a particular arc or an arc from a particular publisher, or that some people or these people are getting arcs and not them, or that publishers need to take a chance on smaller accounts and that they will give more attention to a book than a bigger account, or that they will be more appreciative of something because they are a smaller account, which I don't think is accurate. I don't think that it's, an either or situation. I don't think people's personalities are reduced to their follower count. I think there are people with large accounts that will be incredibly grateful to receive certain books and talk about them in depth. Now, I do think that they are more likely to be given a lot of unsolicited books that may not match their reading taste and may overwhelm them. And so no, they're not going to talk about every book, but that is a risk the publisher is taking based on their account size and their potential reach. And just because an account is smaller doesn't mean the tastes are going to align either, or that someone is going to inherently give a more in-depth review because they have a smaller following. I find that a little disingenuous and reductive. But I understand the wants and feelings behind those statements. I do. I just get tired of seeing it in my feed again and again and again. And with that again, I recognize some of this, like I said earlier, may just be engagement bait. There are a lot of cyclical discourses that it feels like people are trying to bait people into, especially on threads, rather than having organic conversations. But in terms of arc-specific discourse, I see like a lot of that, but then I also see the inverse of like the horror stories of people's interactions, either as an author or a reader in the arc reading space or the reviewing space for ARC teams or self-published authors. And so it's this really interesting tension. And I'm not pretending that an ARC isn't an incredible gift, especially from a self-published or indie author who have less resources. Every sale matters to an even more extreme. I do think that in a lot of the conversations we have between self-published and traditionally published kind of books, that mid-list gets lost a lot. I think that a lot of mid-list authors are getting a lot less support than some indie authors or self-published authors take for granted that they might be getting. However, I recognize what that means, especially when we do have piracy problems in relation to self-published indie published work that really puts authors' careers in jeopardy. I recognize that an ARC is a gift in that way and is a big deal. At the same time, I think we are placing ARCs, or continuing to place ARCs, on this pedestal in which some people are using it as a kind of status symbol, or viewing it or internalizing it as some kind of status symbol that at the end of the day, it's really not. And I don't say that to be mean. I don't say that to discredit the achievement of getting something that you really want in terms of an ARC. I say that for your own mental health, for my own mental health, so we don't internalize this as any kind of reflection on ourselves rather than just the nature of business. And I know that there's a lot potentially on the back end of the influencer side of this, as again, book influencers have really come onto the scene in a bigger way. And I have not been privy to any conversations with PR teams, with publishers, in a way that I have real insight into the conversations that are going on there. And I know there have been a lot of revelations about things that some influencers are paid for that shock even me, because I really do value honest reviews, while also again recognizing the tension there and believing people should be compensated for the promotion they're doing where it is asked for. And again, I also want to recognize my privilege in being able to take a step back, to be able to afford my own books, to be able to utilize such a robust library system. But I also think that there is, before I fully end this, and again, a lot of this is tangent, a lot of this is kind of spitballing. I threw my notes out the window a long time ago without wanting to sound too harsh. In some of this discourse, there is a level of entitlement. The idea that as a reader, you would be entitled to someone's work for free. And that has kind of spanned across discourses. If I see one more post that I have to believe are rage bait, trying to claim that audiobook subscription services are a scam because you pay $15 for one audiobook credit, which is an incredibly reduced rate. If any of you, like me, remember the cost of like a book on CD, and also just the costs that go into that, the author's time being worth money, the narrator's time being worth money. Irregardless, separate tangent. But with that, the work is worth something. It should be worth something. We are not entitled to the work. That is not saying, again, that there should only be arcs for the people with the biggest following. Again, I think that that is reductive and that there are people that engage with these books across the spectrum and across the community. But as the community grows, it's just supply and demand that not everyone is going to have access to an arc, unfortunately. And so publishers and authors have to make calls on how they're going to utilize that limited publicity and marketing. Now, again, I don't think that means only stipulate good reviews. I think that's disingenuous. And as a reader, I am distrustful of that, full stop. So if I only see 5-star ratings on a book, I just assume that something like that is going on and that I can't trust those reviews and I have to wait. So yeah, I guess I just have a lot of feelings regarding arcs and a lot of feelings that have evolved over time. Again, I'm very sympathetic to like all sides of the discourse in this, even as I'm getting tired of some particular types of the discourse in this. And I don't want this to come across condescending or flippant or judgy. It's just where I'm sitting with the thing right now, and it could change. It clearly has already, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this because I feel like there's just been a lot of conversation that feels like it has been exacerbated lately, and I know that the prevalence of social media has made this a little more centralized and a little bit more visible than it has been historically. So just let me know what you're thinking, how you engage with arcs, how you view arc reviews, how you view people talking about arcs and arc reviews, and whether they've gotten certain arcs or not, how they engage with an arc, what you as a reader find valuable and helps you make a decision about a book, because at the end of the day, that is what is most important. I know what helps me make a decision about a book, but I am not everyone. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you for indulging me in this more conversational tangent. And as always, thank you for being interested in my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,